You need a family. You need friends. Like, you don't need to have all these things, but you better have most of them. Family, friends, career, educational goals, plans for, time outside of work, attention to your mental and physical health, etc. That's what life is about. And if you don't have any of those things, well, then all you've got left is misery and suffering. So that's a bad deal for you. So, number one, specify your damn goals, because how are you going to hit something if you don't know what it is? That isn't going to happen. And often people won't specify their goals too, because they don't like to specify conditions for failure. So if you keep yourself all vague and foggy, which is real easy, because that's just a matter of not doing as well, then you don't know when you fail. And people might say, well, I really don't want to know when I fail because that's painful. So I'll keep myself blind about when I fail. That's fine, except you'll fail all the time then. You just won't know it until you've failed so badly that you're done. And that can easily happen by the time you're 40. So I would recommend that you don't let that happen. So that's willful blindness, right? You could have known, but you chose not to. Okay, so once you get your goal structure set up, you think, okay, if I could have this life, it looks like that might be worth living, despite the fact that it's going to be, anxiety provoking and threatening, and there's going to be some suffering and loss involved and all of that. Obviously, the goal is to have a vision for your life such that all things considered, that justifies your effort. Okay, so then what do? Well, then you turn down to the micro routines. It's like, okay, well, this is what I'm aiming for. How does that instantiate itself day to day, week to week, month to month? And that's where something like a schedule can be unbelievably useful. Google Calendar. It's like, make a damn schedule and stick to it. Okay, so what's the rule with a schedule? It's not a bloody prison. That's the first thing that people do wrong. They say, well, I don't like to follow a schedule. It's like, well, what kind of schedule are you setting up? Well, I have to do this, then I have to do this, then I have to do this, and then I just go play video games, because who wants to do all these things that I have to do? It's like, wrong. Set the damn schedule up so that you have the day you want. That's the trick. It's like, okay, I've got tomorrow. If I was going to set it up so it was the best possible day I could have, practically speaking, what would it look like? Well, then you schedule that. And obviously there's a bit of responsibility that's going to go along with that, because if you have any sense, one of the things that you're going to insist upon is that at the end of the day, you're not in worse shape than you were than at the beginning of the day, right? Because that's a stupid day. If you have a bunch of those in a row, you just dig yourself a hole and then you bury yourself in it. It's like, sorry, that's just not a good strategy. It's a bad strategy. So maybe 20% of your day has to be responsibility and obligation, or maybe it's more than that, depending on how far behind you are. But even that, you can ask yourself, okay, well, I've got these responsibilities. I have to schedule the damn things in. What's the right ratio of responsibility to reward? And you can ask yourself that, just like you'd negotiate with someone who is working for you. So I want you to work tomorrow. And you might say, okay, well, what are you going to do for me that makes it likely that I'll work for you? Well, you could ask yourself that, So maybe you do an hour of responsibility and then you play a video game for 15 minutes. I don't know, whatever turns your crank, man. But, you have to negotiate with yourself and not tyrannize yourself. Like you're negotiating with someone that you care for, that you would like to be productive and have a good life. And that's how you make the schedule. It's like, and then you look at the day and you think, well, if I had that day, that'd be good. Great. And you're useless and horrible, so you'll probably only hit it with about 70% accuracy, but that beats the hell out of 0. Right? And if you hit it even with 50% accuracy, another rule is, well, aim for 51% the next week, or 50.5% for God's sake, because you're going to hit that position where things start to loop back positively and spiral you upward. So that's one way that you can work on your conscientiousness, is plan a life you'd like to have. And you do that partly by referring to social norms. That's more or less rescuing your father from the belly of the whale. But the other way you do that is by having a little conversation with yourself about, as if you don't really know who you are, because you know what you're like. You won't do what you're told. You won't do what you tell yourself to do. You must have noticed that. It's like you're a bad employee and a worse boss, and both of those work for you. You don't know what you want to do, and then when you tell yourself what to do, you don't do it anyways. But, my point is that you have to understand that you're not your own servant, so to speak. You're someone that you have to negotiate with. And you're someone that you want to present the opportunity of having a good life to. And that's hard for people, because they don't like themselves very much. They're always like cracking the whip and then procrastinating and cracking the whip and then procrastinating. And it's like, God, it's so boring and such a pathetic way of spending your time. And you know what that's like because you probably waste like 6 hours a day. What you do now is going to multiply its effects in the future. And you need to know what your damn time is worth. One of the things you should be asking yourself is, when you spend an hour, was that, well, would have I paid someone $50 to have had that hour? And if the answer is no, it's like, well, maybe you should do something else with your time. And it depends on whether or not you think that your time's worthwhile. But the funny thing about not assuming that is if you assume your time isn't worthwhile, what happens is you don't just sit around sort of randomly in a state of responsibility-less bliss. What you do is you suffer existentially. And so you have to say, I'm going to act as if being is good. I'm going to act as if truth is the pathway to enlightenment. I'm going to act as if I should pursue the deepest meaning possible in my life. And there's reasons to do none of those. They're real reasons. So it's really a decision. But you can't find out what the consequence of the decision is unless you make the decision. You know, I have done my best with every single thing I've talked to you guys about. I have done my best to do what Dostoevsky does in his novels, which is I make a proposition and then I spend months or years trying to figure out if I can take the bloody thing apart, if there's something wrong with it, because I want to find out. I want to hit it with a hammer and see if it breaks. And what I've been trying to do is to tell you all the things that I've gathered, let's say, or laid out or articulated or discovered over the last 30 years that I have not been able to break with the biggest hammer that I could take to them. And I guess that's the fundamental one, is that I believe that the idea that lurks in these images, derived from very different cultures, it's the same idea. Life is suffering. Right. Indisputable. What do you do about that? You voluntarily accept it. And then strive to overcome the suffering that's a consequence of that. And you do that for you, and you do that in a way that makes it better for other people. And then that works. And one question might be, well, how well does it work? And the answer is, the only way that you can find out is by trying it. That's it. That's the existential element of it. The proof is to be derived by the incarnation of the attitude in your own life. No one can tell you how it will work for you. It's the thing that your destiny is to discover that. And you have to make the decisions to begin with, because you can't do this without commitment. You have to commit to it first. That's the act of faith that Kierkegaard was so insistent upon. You have to say, I'm going to act as if being is good. I'm going to act as if truth is the pathway to enlightenment. I'm going to act as if I should pursue the deepest meaning possible in my life. And there's reasons to do none of those. They're real reasons. So it's really a decision. But you can't find out what the consequence of the decision is unless you make the decision. I think the same thing happens when you get married, by the way. If you think you might leave, you're not married. And then you think, well, the marriage didn't succeed. It's like, well, maybe you were never married. Because the rule is, you don't get to leave. And there's a reason for that rule. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't situations where there should be exceptions made for that. That's not the point. The point is that there's some games you don't get to play unless you're all in. The other thing that's so interesting about being alive is that you're all in. No matter what you do, you're all in. This is going to kill you. So I think you might as well play the most magnificent game you can while you're waiting. Because do you have anything better to do? Really? Why not pick the best thing possible that you could do? Why not do that? Maybe you could justify your wretched existence to yourself that way. I think you could. That's what it looks like. You know, people find such meaning in the responsibilities they adopt. It stops making them ask questions about what life is for. If you have a newborn child, for example, like unless you're really in a bad way, psychotically depressed, or maybe your personality really needs some retooling, you stop thinking about anything but ensuring that that baby is doing well. And if someone comes along and asks you an existential question about your commitment to that, the right response is, why are you asking me such stupid questions when this is manifesting itself right in front of your eyes? Like, how blind can you be? That isn't a time for questions about the meaning of life. The answer is right in front of you. And if you can't see it, it's not because life has no meaning. It's because you're blind. I mean, that's what the image of the Virgin Mother and the child is all about. It's like, what's the answer to the meaning of life? Here's an answer. It's like, well, I'm going to criticize that. Well, go right ahead. You're like a termite gnawing on a temple. There's no utility in that sort of criticism. It's blindness. And it's the same thing with regards to the path of the hero. It glistens in front of you, and you can criticize it. It's like, fine. Put the cart before the horse and see how far you get.
If they would have been, I bet you 10% better, we would not be in this situation right now. We would probably have Kamala Harris as the president-elect, because most people are willing to swallow a lot of shit. You know what I mean? Like, we all have our own problems, all of our own stuff, but they went so in on all of the lies. The fact that Barack Obama, 2 days before the election, gave a speech, I think it was in Wisconsin, where he said that Donald Trump went to a white supremacist rally and said there were very fine people on both sides. The fact that he ran with that hoax again after it has been debunked
by people who wouldn't debunk it unless it was seriously not true.
I think the first time that got to mainstream media was me on Real Time, because James Carville brought it up with Maher, and I had never heard it said on mainstream, and I wasn't going to let him get away with it. And I said, what are you talking about? The next sentence out of his mouth was, but I'm not talking about the white supremacists and the neo-Nazis who should be condemned entirely. But Carville literally crumbles to the table because he did not know what to do when confronted with reality. And then Bill said, well, it was worded inarticulately or something to that effect. And I thought, well, that's an interesting way of playing a little bit of cleanup on that. But the point is, they thought, I think Obama, what would your psychological analysis of Obama be right there? It's 2 days before the election. He either believes it, which there's no way he could be that dumb and ignorant. Simply impossible. But maybe you want to give him 5% chance. You want to give him 5%? What do you want to give him on that? Let's give him 20%, right? Okay, great, 20%. So he's unbelievably dumb and ignorant, and he ran the speech by nobody who's willing to confront him with reality. Or what would the only alternative be? He knows he can lie. It doesn't matter how big the lie is. And he thinks the lie will accomplish the goal, that the ends justify the means. I think they got to the end of that road. I think that's what this election was. You cannot tell us that there are very fine people on both sides. You can't tell us that Brett Kavanaugh is a serial rapist, or that the Covington kids are racist, or that Kyle Rittenhouse is a white supremacist. I mean, we could do a million versions. That 6-foot social distancing was scientifically backed. And I think that's actually what this election was about. It really, Trump then became the avatar that was sort of wrapped around that thing. And then Kamala basically became the avatar for the machine.
We talked too about the fact that in the last month, a lot of radical things happened around Trump the last month.
Oh yeah.
I mean, the fact that this weird coalition gathered around him, which is, completely preposterous. It's completely preposterous.
Yeah.
That Elon Musk is now going to be running the Department of Governmental Efficiency, and that has the same acronym as Doge.
Yeah,
that was a coin, and it's a funny dog, and it's do only good every day. It's like, what the hell is going on here? It's ridiculously comical that Musk is actually an X-Man, because that's the name of his platform, and that idea has been obsessing him for years, and that Gabbard is on board, and that Robert F. Kennedy came along, and that Vance is along, and so is Vivek Ramaswamy. I mean, these are very unlikely Republicans, very unlikely. And so that's weird as hell. And it's like, seriously, surreally, this is Pulp Fiction weird. It's
so what do you
strange.
think the unifying principle is? To me, it's that they love America. Like, that's sort of like you would say low resolution bumper sticker.
Yeah. I think it's analogous in some ways on the political side to what happened with the media, the new media that we were describing. There wasn't anything really that we had in common, let's say you and I, or Weinstein, or Rogan, Shapiro, like that was a very diverse group of people.
It was free speech in the most, I guess in the essence. Right?
It was. Well, I think the thing we had in common essentially was our approach to discourse.
Yeah.
That was really all.
Yeah.
I mean, each of us taken in pairs had things in common, but it was devotion to discourse, open discourse, conversational discourse, essentially.
Yeah.
And in a sense, on agenda-free conversational discourse. I mean, one of the things that makes Rogan so perennially popular is that he's just trying to figure out what's going on. And that really is the case.
Yeah.
And Rogan, that what you see is what you get. He's all you people, all the people in that group are exactly the same on camera and off.
Yeah.
Exactly. There's no persona. They're just exactly who they are. And all of those people were and are iconoclastic, right? They didn't fit well in organizations. They all started their own thing. And that's really the same thing that's characteristic of these people that have gathered around Trump. And then, as we alluded to, we also have this other strange occurrence, which is the death throes of the legacy media. Douglas Murray, I talked to him the other day, and he said, well, don't throw all of the legacy media under the bus. There is the New York Post, for example. The Fox News people are trying to do their best. And,
sure.
You have the Free Press with Barry, but that's new media too. Mm-hmm. So by and large, the liberal end of the legacy media have doomed themselves to perdition because they got partisan and deceitful.
Look,
and they were also willingly blind because they didn't pay attention to the new media at all.
Well, nobody could be that bad at their job. No janitor could be so horrible at his job and still have a job the next day. Joe Scarborough lies every day. He sits in a chair at MSNBC at a giant corporation to lie. Somebody up there, I don't know who his boss is, but somebody up the chain of the corporation knows that he's lying about all of these things. They know that Joy Reid is in essence a neo-racist, or that Rachel Maddow spent 3 years relentlessly lying about vaccines and COVID. So what people, I think, have to understand is they're paid to lie.
Well,
they are well paid to push a particular narrative.
Part of the difference with the old media, let's say, the corporate media, and the new media is that those organizations are corporations, and the people that you see are the front men for the organization.
Exactly.
They're not investigative. They're not independent investigative journalists. Now, I know you claim that that you're not a journalist, and technically that's true, but that's the roughest equivalent because I don't know, apart from podcaster, I don't know what the definition is. So
yeah, I would. It's something like I'm trying to translate the nonsense, but that's not a
talk show host.
Yeah, I'm a talk show. I'm a talk show host. Yeah, whatever Phil Donahue was. That's what I am.
Well, that's that's right. That's right. Yeah. That's what I'm doing with my podcast too. They're talk shows.
But why is it then that for the last let's say starting when COVID started, like that day, all of the hoaxes that we've all been through, why is it that I didn't fall for any of them? Why is it that my track record, I get political predictions wrong all the time. I thought DeSantis could win the primary. I have no problem admitting that. I thought there was a different way the Republicans could go. And by the way, I'm thrilled with the result. I couldn't be happier. I fought for Trump and all that stuff. So putting aside political predictions, why is it that I didn't screw up why didn't I fall for all of the hoaxes? Why, when the Jussie Smollett thing came out and they said that two black guys, or that he was lynched by two guys with MAGA hats who said this is MAGA country, and it turned out to be these black brothers that he paid. Why is it that I didn't immediately fall for the hoax? Yeah, Kamala Harris immediately tweeted out that this proves we're a white supremacist nation, and I think that's still I think that tweet is still up. Why is it that MSNBC fell for every hoax? Why is it that I didn't fall for all of the COVID hoaxes? By day 15, I thought, okay, 2 weeks to stop the spread. We're done now. And now they've moved on to something else. It's not because I'm some kind of genius. Why did you not fall for all these hoaxes? Why did Rogan not really fall for all these hoaxes? And everyone, I'd say to some degree, we all got screwed up by COVID in some ways. And, I think you've even said that you got, I think I did your first interview back after your health stuff, and you said that you got vaxxed, and you thought the whole idea was now the government, if I can quote you directly, was leave me the fuck alone.
Yeah. That's what I thought. I thought, okay.
And it's interesting. I remember thinking when you said that to me on air, I thought, that's interesting because I never thought that.
Yeah.
I thought if I do it, they'll never leave me alone. And I think that actually turned out to be more true in some
definitely.
sense.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, well,
but what is it? What is it about us then?
Well, I think partly we put our finger on it with regard to the fact that you don't have a whole corporation behind you composed of people and advertisers that are all thinking the same thing and purveying the same message, right? So you can go out and scavenge for information. That's the other thing too, is the information environment that surrounds you. This is a point they made on MSNBC. Yeah. I think it was the guy who runs Axios, who was the commentator. I think we're going to probably clip that into this show. He pointed out that, people who are on the cutting edge of the technological world, let's say the online media world, they're information scavengers. Like I gather information from, I'm on X a fair bit, but I gather information from a lot of different sources. It's not an easy thing to do. And so the information pipeline that you have isn't a legacy media monolith by any stretch of the imagination. And I think a lot of these people, the charitable interpretation is rather than being outright purveyors of falsehoods, they're in an ecosystem where it's like a monoculture. Everybody thinks the same thing.
Right. It's like a fish swimming in water that's so polluted, a tank that's so polluted that he can't see right in front of him, even though his memory is short anyway, but now he literally can't see where he's swimming. Think about it. Why is it that I did a video in 2019, people can find it, saying Joe Biden has clearly the beginnings of dementia or something cognitively wrong with him. 2019. Again, I'm not a doctor. I was just watching the videos like everybody else. I watched the corn pop video.
But how much time do you spend every week looking at media information?
No, an awful lot.
Well, how much?
I would say I'm definitely within the X Twitter ecosystem a couple hours a day. So that's a pretty significant amount of time. I try not to do it on the weekends. I do my August off the grid thing, which I think also has helped me stay sane throughout this because I get out of the hamster wheel basically, once a year for 8 years now. But the Biden cognitive issue, they lied and lied and lied, and they kept saying, "Don't see what you see," and he's still president right now.
I know, it's
although something seems to have turned on because I think he's starting to realize, man, he's got a legacy and he can figure it out in the next 2 months. And I think his legacy, if he's smart, and I don't know what's left of him, but if Jill and whoever else is around him that has sense with them, they have an incredible opportunity right now. And I hope they'll take this. The opportunity is you have no reason to placate to the left. You were brought in because you were old Joe the moderate. You weren't crazy Bernie. You weren't Elizabeth Warren. You weren't one of the radicals. You governed like one of them. They took advantage of you. But now they clearly tried to screw you by forcing him out. He's basically said that. That's what he said on The View, that they forced him out. He thought he was going to win. So we'll find out what happened there one day because eventually the truth will come out. But what an interesting moment he has right now. He has 2 months to say, I have no reason to play with you children anymore, and I can build a legacy. So what could my legacy be? Well, maybe Donald Trump's not Hitler. And maybe I could do a few things like, I don't know, maybe somehow winding down some portion of the Iraq war or helping Israel win their war, getting our hostages back, the American hostages, if not the Israelis, or maybe doing something about the border, which they are doing a little more now. He has an interesting moment right now where his legacy could be, he took us to the precipice of hell. He got taken advantage of, right? They'll write about it one day. But then right there, when he had a moment, the 2 months between administrations, he did something right. And I don't think that's complete. A lot of people are saying I'm nuts for that. But if you were Joe Biden, and again, we don't know what's really in his mind or what he's capable of cognitively at this point, but wouldn't that be a pretty good ending to the story?
There's this idea in the Old Testament that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, and it's a pretty harsh idea. But there's something really useful about it, because one of the things you see with people all the time is that maybe they're trying to stumble forward towards their ideal, as poorly defined as it might be, but then they're afraid, right? They're afraid about what they might encounter, and that stops them, because fear does stop people. It freezes you like a prey animal, and so people move ahead, but then they get afraid, and then they stop moving ahead. And that's not so good, because negative emotion is a really powerful motivator. So we're more motivated by negative emotion than positive emotion. Quantitatively speaking, you can measure that. And that's, I think, because we can only be so happy, but we can really be suffering and dead, So we have to pay more attention to the negative. And that's bad because the negative can stop you. And then in my clinical practice, I often talk to people who are trying to make a difficult life decision, and they're weighing out the costs and the benefits of making the life decision, And one of the things I always talk to them about is, wait a second, that's an incomplete analysis. You have to weigh out the benefits and the costs of doing this. And you have to weigh out the costs and benefits of not doing it. And that's not the same as the zero that you assume that you're starting with, right? Because to not make a decision also has a cost. And sometimes the cost of not making a decision is far worse than the cost of making a decision, even if the decision is risky. And so one of the things you can derive from that, and this is very useful, I think, is that this is also, I think, why it's so useful to contemplate your mortality, so to speak, is you're screwed no matter what you do. And that actually frees you, is that you have path A that has catastrophes and you have path B that has catastrophes, and you don't get to have the no catastrophe path, but you get to pick which one. And that's really something, because if you know that there's terrible risk associated with everything that you do and don't do, then you can afford to take some risks, because you're not, and this is all within the ark metaphor. I'm still making the case that despite the fact that your life is essentially catastrophic, you can make a covenant with the highest ideal, and that will take you through it the best way possible. I'm still making that case. So then you think, okay, well, I'm trying to make this decision. I'm going to go try to do something difficult. And isn't that terrifying? And then you think, yeah, but wait a minute. What's really terrifying is not doing it. And then you think about the cost of not doing it. So in the future authoring program, we have people do this little meditative exercise, which is, okay, just think about your insufficiencies by your own definition, right? The way that you don't do what you know you should do. About the things that you do that you shouldn't do, that you know you shouldn't do beyond a shadow of a doubt, right? There's some things like that. And that's bad habits and poor aim and all of the resentment and hatred and aggression and unresolved conflicts and all those things that are dementing you and warping you, and then think, okay, those things get the upper hand, man. They get the upper hand, and they take you the worst possible place you could go in the next 3 to 5 years. What exactly does that look like? And so you sketch all that out, and you think, hey, I don't want to go there. And so the next time that a temptation comes up, you think, well, it'd be a lot better for me if I didn't succumb to this temptation. It's like, that's kind of weak, eh? You'd look a little better if you didn't eat like a cheesecake a day or something like that. That's something, but it's not the same as, I'm going to have diabetes and I'm going to lose my damn leg in 5 years if I don't get my eating under control. That's motivating. And so then the temptation comes along and you think, oh, how about no? Seriously, how about no? Not just because a higher good would be obtained if I avoided it, but because a terrible catastrophe would be averted if I didn't. And so you want to get your fear behind you, right? You want to get it behind you where it's pushing you forward instead of in front of you where it's stopping you. And you get your fear behind you, pushing you forward by actually thinking through the consequences of not putting your life together. And the least of those is that you waste it and suffer, right? Because you're going to suffer anyways, man. So you waste it and suffer. That's a bad deal. Because maybe if you're going to suffer, you could at least do something noble and glorious and upright and powerful and honorable and admirable and helpful and difficult. That's just so much better. And maybe that's good enough so that you think, hey, little suffering, it's basically worth it. At least it's a way forward, At least it's a way forward. Beauty is one pathway towards God. And if you can't find another pathway, then why don't you use beauty? I'm sure most of you do that with music, because music is the one thing that modern people can't be cynical about. Thank God for that. And I've been fascinated by music because of that. It speaks meaning to people, right? I've mentioned to people that they should clean up their rooms. That's become quite the internet meme. But I'm really serious about it because it's really hard to do that. And I've been cleaning up my room, by the way, for about 4 months now because my life was thrown into such a catastrophe and also we were renovating. And so, but it isn't just that you clean it up, you also make it beautiful. And it's really hard to make something beautiful. And it's really worthwhile. And what's really cool is if you learn to make something beautiful, even one thing, if you can just make one thing in your life beautiful, then you've established a relationship with beauty. And then you can start to expand that relationship with beauty out into the world, like into other elements of your life. And that is so worthwhile. It's incredibly, crazily worthwhile. And that's an invitation to the divine. You know, you have to be daring to do that. And people are terrified of it. People are terrified of color. They paint their walls beige. They're terrified of art. They buy some mass-produced thing because they don't want anybody laughing at them for their lack of taste. Because what do you know, right? You have to develop it. And so you're going to stumble along and make mistakes to begin with. It's kind of hard on your self-esteem, but you're stumbling towards the kingdom of God. That's what you're stumbling towards when you try to make an aesthetic decision and to put something in your life that's beautiful. And it's unbelievably worthwhile to do that. Man does not live by bread alone. That's exactly right. We live by beauty. We live by literature. We live by art. And literally, not metaphorically. We cannot live without it because life is too dismal and tragic in the absence of the sublime. So, and ourselves, we have to be sharp so that we can survive properly and orient the world properly and not destroy things, including ourselves. You are somewhere, you're a certain way, you're moving forward, something happens that you don't expect, it blows you into pieces, it introduces chaos, right? You face the dragon, you get the gold, or maybe the bloody thing eats you and the story is over. And then you get to where you're going. But then the question is, well, what happens when you get to where you're going? And that's a really important issue because one of the things that happens to people all the time in their life is that they get to where they're going and then they don't know what to do, right? So, for example, you graduate from university. It's like, okay, story over. Who are you now? Who are you the next day? And so what happens is when you succeed, then there's a success crisis. And the success crisis is, well, I've run this story to its end. Now what? What you should do when your story comes to an end, when you've achieved what it is that you want to achieve, when you've achieved what you need to achieve, then the next question is, okay, well, now I'm that person or I have that character. What do I need to do next? And some of that is always, well, what do I need to give up now? What do I need to let go of so I can move to the next plateau, right? Assuming that your life is a sequence of upward moving. It's like Sisyphus, except you're actually, each time you climb up the mountain, you get a little higher on the mountain. It's something like that. So it's Sisyphus with an optimistic bent. And maybe if you push the rock up the mountain properly and let it roll down, then, and if you do that right, then it's okay. Every time you roll it back up, it's better in some sense. You know, one of the experiences I've had in my life, fairly commonly, in a variety of different ways, this is especially true when I was paying a lot of attention to my dreams, which I did for about 15 years, I guess, something like that. Now and then I would feel like I'd learned some things and had sort of consolidated them. And then before I went to sleep, I'd think, okay, I'm ready to learn something else. It's like, and I didn't say that without trepidation. And because usually when you learn something, you know, it's not that pleasant because you usually learn something about why you're wrong. And the deeper the thing that you learn, the more you learn about why you're wrong. And there's a death that's associated with that because then you have to let that part of you that's wrong die. And that's the sacrifice, right? And so you have to make a sacrifice. You have to be willing to make a sacrifice before you're going to learn something. Perhaps what you'll learn is in proportion to your willingness to make a sacrifice. And I really do believe that. I do believe that as well because I also think that if you commit to something, that means that you don't do a bunch of other things, right? So that's the sacrifice of all those other things. You commit to it and you set your sights on it. If you really commit to it and you get the sacrifice right, so to speak, then the probability that that thing will be successful vastly increases. And I think that that's also not a naive way of thinking or a foolish way of thinking. My experience has been that that's the case.
People exist in a sacrificial relationship to the world. What does that mean? It seems to mean something like human beings are aware of their extended self. You know you're going to be around tomorrow and next week and next month and next year and 5 years from now and 10 years from now. Now it's less certain as you go out, but you do have the sense of yourself as something that stretches across the decades. Okay, and so what that means is that you have to conduct yourself in a manner that isn't merely immediate. You have to conduct yourself in a manner that will work across time. Now, how do people do that? They work. Work is a sacrificial gesture. So you work, by definition, virtually. Work is the sacrifice of the present for the future. I mean, maybe someone can come up with a better definition of work than that, but I don't think so. It's like you put in time and effort right now, even if it's something not what you'd like to be doing at the moment. You put in time and effort because you believe, what the hell does that mean? You believe it'll pay off. Well, is that a contract with the future? Is it a covenant? Because the relationship that the biblical corpus characterizes human striving is covenantal. It's a bargain. The bargain is you make the right sacrifices and they pay off. That's the bargain. Now, you might say, well, that's just part of the social contract, but the biblical corpus insists that it's deeper than that. It's built into the structure of reality itself. And that if you got the sacrifices right, the future would be paradisal. That's a kind of sacrifice right there, is that you're willing to sacrifice your short-term physiological and psychological comfort for a medium to long-term benefit. It's the essence of sacrifice. This is something the atheists don't understand about the biblical narrative, is that the narrative insists that we live in a sacrificial relationship. It's the essence of humanity to live in a sacrificial relationship. It's like, well, is that true or not? Well, as you mature, your relationships are more sacrificial. It's less about what you, in your narrow sense, want right now, and it's more about what's good over the medium to long run, including other people. Well, that's a sacrificial relationship. Now, the covenant, and this is a matter of faith. It's the matter of the deepest faith. Are you willing to act out the proposition that the way to make the world reveal itself to you in its most positive guise is for you to adopt the most appropriate sacrificial relationship? Well, it's a big risk, isn't it? Because you have to give up everything. That's the deal. You give up everything that's low. Everything. Well, that's what the Christian passion is, because the Christian passion is an archetypal story, because Christ is the person who sacrifices everything, thoroughly, 100%. There's no indecision because you age. Like, you pay for your indecision. It's a decision. It's a decision to avoid, fundamentally. And part of the moral that's embedded in the story of Job and in the Christian passion is that you can master what you'll face. And maybe that's true. I mean, the clinical literature seems to indicate that it's true, because one of the things you do, if you're a competent clinician, is you look at what people are attempting to accomplish, and maybe that needs some retooling, but let's assume that they have a goal in mind that would work, right? You talk it through with them strategically. They have a well laid out vision. Okay, now they're laying out the vision and they encounter impediments that stop them. And maybe they're impediments that make them afraid and paralyze them. And so then what you do is you decompose the impediment until you find a way they can advance that constitutes a genuine advance that they'll actually do. So what you do is you take the problem and you narrow it until they'll face it. Okay, then they face it. Then what happens? They get more competent. That's what happens. And then they get better at facing all problems. So they don't just learn how to deal with that specific problem. They learn a lesson that generalizes across problems. They get braver. When you use exposure therapy, people don't get less afraid, they get braver. And that's way better, because braver moves from situation to situation. Okay, so the question is, if you faced everything that was put in front of you, who would you be? Well, the biblical answer is you'd be a true son of God. That's the biblical answer. It's like, well, do you believe that? Well, it depends on what you mean by believe. Do you have a better bet than facing what's there? Well, you just have to be sensible about it for a moment. It's like, is your theory that you're going to adapt better using falsehood and avoidance? Because that's the contrary theory. You either face it, and you do that predicated on the faith that something in you will respond if you do, or you don't face it. That's it. Those are the options. If you don't face it, that's faith too. That's faith in the notion that avoidance and deception will suffice. There's technically two different forms of reward. There's consumatory reward. That's what an orgasm is. It's consumatory reward. It brings the behavioral and perceptual sequence to a halt. It ends it. Right at the climax, it ends it. But then it's over. that journey is over, right? Then there's the dopaminergic reward, and dopaminergic reward is evidence of advancement towards a goal, right? Okay, so there's a corollary to that. Well, how do you become optimally engaged? Because dopamine facilitates engagement and focus, which is why drugs like amphetamines can be used for kids who are attention deficit disordered. You tap up the dopamine response, they lock on, right? Okay, so they're locking on to a goal-directed pursuit. The problem with amphetamines is that they can lock you on so hard you can't get out of the frame. So like kids on amphetamines will obsess, for example, about cleaning up their closet. They can't switch to the next activity. Okay, dopaminergic reward is reward that's accrued in relationship to a goal. Okay, so what's an implication of that? Well, pursue the highest possible goal. Well, why? Because the kick from advancement is higher. Now, you have to balance that. It can't be, you have to advance, right? Because imagine the reward's got two components. Number one is you're moving towards something valuable. Okay, so you want it to be as valuable as possible. Okay, but you have to be moving. You need something extremely valuable that you can move towards. Okay, so part of the reason that you establish a relationship with God, let's say, is because that's what sets the upper bound to your vision. It's like, I want things to be the best they could be. That's a vision of paradise. Well, that has to be fractionated into, your proximal decisions, but lurking behind that should be this continual movement towards, what would you say, a heaven that recedes as you approach it. That's the proper vision of heaven. A heaven is a place that's perfect and getting better, both at the same time. That's what music shows you, because a great piece of music is perfect, but it's just getting better as it unfolds. And you need that. This is part of the problem with a static utopian vision, something Dostoevsky criticized. If you gave people nothing but consummatory reward, he famously says, so that they can do nothing but sit in tubs of hot water, eat cake, and busy themselves with the continuation of the species, human beings would break that all to hell in a moment, just so they have something interesting to do. If you run yourself through a disciplinary process, so you accomplish something, maybe you don't attain the goal you were aiming at, but you accrue a new way of looking at the world and a set of skills. Well, if you just keep doing that, you have multiple ways of looking at the world and more skill. Well, that's your storehouse of treasure. As you walk through life in your normal mode, things will call to you. And if you pursue them, they will take you deep. It doesn't really matter what it is that calls. What matters is that you pursue it, and you pursue it to the depths. And as you pursue it to the depths, you will become transformed. And if you do that without reservation, that will turn you into the person who frees the slaves and opposes the tyrants. And that is how it works. That's the call. And that can happen in any direction, virtually any direction. You just have to pursue it with sufficient faith. It's really something to see how many people are dying for a lack of an encouraging word. They don't get encouragement. And people need so little encouragement. It's just unbelievable. I believe that truth will save the world. I believe that. So you speak truthfully, and you watch what happens, and you take your consequences. You're a net force for good if you want to be. One of the things you do with people who are struggling is you make the simple even simpler, because then they can get a toehold. Like if they're really barely able to move. I had one client, he had a hard life, man. He was like 85. He'd fallen off a ladder and broken his neck, and they had permanently fused it. So he was basically like this. He could hardly move. He was so depressed. He literally couldn't get out of bed. It was awful. And he was in chronic pain because of his broken neck. And so the first thing I did with him was get him to sit up for like 30 seconds. That was it. That's where he had to start, and after I worked with him when he was in the hospital, after 2 weeks, he was walking down the hall and able to sit up and read for, 5 or 6 minutes. And he got out of the hospital. He went home, but he had to start with the simplest possible steps. And hey, man, this is the definition of humility in some ways, is that you start progressing where you can start.
So what does that tell you about the psychological, what I would say is weakness, but maybe I would want to hear your adjective on that, of the good liberal? the good liberal who allowed all of this to come in?
Yep,
this is a compassion issue?
Well, when all this started, and I think it was the same with you, I regarded myself as a classic British liberal, essentially. Yeah. But I've come to understand something over the last 8 years that I didn't understand in the beginning, as certainly not as well anyways, is that liberal individualism only works when the collective is so well established that you can take it for granted.
Yes.
So as long as the self-evident truths remain self-evident, then you can have something like a liberal individualism.
So it's basically, as long as the conservatives are holding the door from the barbarians, then the liberals can be liberal.
Exactly that.
And that's how a functional society should work, in essence.
Well, in the story of the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, so the Shire is full of, well, let's call them liberals.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And
they're smoking some stuff.
They're hobbits, and they're all pursuing their own thing, and they think their little kingdom is everything. But, the borders are protected by the Striders. Aragorn is one of them. And it turns out that he's the descendant of ancient kings. And that's exactly right. It's like, as long as the perimeters are defended by the descendants of ancient kings, then there can be freedom inside the walls. And so, I've been criticized, the more public books I've written have been criticized for, what would you say, making a case out of the self-evident. But we are at a point where the self-evident is no longer self-evident and needs to be explained and defended. And that's actually, what would you say, that's what's turned me into a conservative, to the degree that I am a conservative. It's like, well, all these things that are self-evident have to be restated and also explained.
Right. You wouldn't have had to have written 12 rules for life had the system been operating properly. Right. That's the point. You would think in the year 2000, when you wrote it, 2017, 16, whatever it was, that had the world actually been operating as it should have with all the advancements of humanity, it would not be necessary to say things that are just, why would you pet a cat when you walk by it? Well, there's a reason. There's actually you remember wait, I'll tell you a funny story in a sec, but, Douglas, the line on this about the walls that Douglas has that I love this. And he said this years ago, was that one day the barbarians will be at the gate and we'll be debating what gender pronouns to call them. And I think that's what happened to the liberals. They saw the chaos, and instead of confronting it as the conservatives, and we can do the conservative version of this where their weak spots are too, obviously, but instead of confronting what was going on, how good they had it, they decided to just, we'll let the crazy people just keep running around. And then, the guy's trying to hold the door, and we'll just sort of chisel at his Achilles heel a little bit by not defending him. And we'll kind of call him racist too. Or when other people call him racist and he's not really racist, we won't say anything. And I think that that's really what's happened here. It was sort of like, when they took Alex Jones out originally. I had done Alex Jones' show one time. It's the only time we ever spoke publicly. I remember I said a little something on Twitter, but I was just like, I don't know how close I want to get to this thing. It's all crazy. We all have certain pressure points that we deal with and how much heat you want to take and everything else. I think in retrospect, we all should have been screaming much, much louder. And a lot of people in our circles didn't say a word about that when he got booted off Twitter and kicked off YouTube and all of those things. That we all just thought, it'll kind of never come for us. And to Trump's credit, by the way, what was his main line is, they're not coming for me. They're coming for you. I'm just standing in the way.
Yeah. Well, the fact that he got kicked off Twitter was a perfect example of that. That was just beyond comprehension as far as I was concerned.
Well,
what? Really?
When I went to Twitter, when I got a call one day from someone at Twitter, basically saying, Elon wants to meet you. Can you get here tonight? It was about 3:00 on a Tuesday or something, Tuesday or Thursday. And I called everybody I knew who had a private plane. I was like, somebody's got to get me over there. Nobody could get on. I jump on a plane. I get to Twitter at about 12:30 a.m. This is like a week or two after he bought Twitter. And he comes out, there's all these people there. It's just such a buzz, right? And he comes out. It's about 12:30 a.m. His eyes are bloodshot. and he's clearly tired, right? And you've met him many times now. He dresses like a normal guy. He's in like this ratty t-shirt. It's late at night. His sneakers are dirty, and he's clearly been there for God knows how long. Probably hasn't slept
5 years.
Yeah, probably hasn't slept in however, right? And he says to me, he goes, Dave, I heard about what's been going on with your account. He's like, do you want to do this tonight, or if it's okay, could we do it tomorrow? It's like, this is insane. The world's richest man is basically like, can I work for you tonight at 1 a.m.? I was like, oh, it's actually okay. I'll come back tomorrow. And then I sat there the next day with a whole bunch of engineers who opened the hood of the thing. And the entire system, the entire Twitter system was built to shadow ban. That's it. Everything under the hood of Twitter was built to put filters and tags, and you said this, so now you can't see this, or you connected with that person, so now you can't connect with this person. The entire system was built that way. So Jack Dorsey, who was the CEO for much of it, he testified under oath that they do not shadow ban, but the whole freaking system was built that way. Now, he probably legally didn't get in trouble because shadow ban is not a technical term, and he may have, been, I think he was just playing with the words there. But the point is, there was an entire system basically built to silence a certain set of people and promote another set of people. And now
it didn't work.
And it didn't work. So how cool is that? How cool is that? And that's where we're at right now.
Yeah.
It's really something to see how many people are dying for lack of an encouraging word. They don't get encouragement. And people need so little encouragement. Yeah. It's just unbelievable. I believe that truth will save the world. I believe that. So you speak truthfully and you watch what happens and you take your consequences. You're a net force for good if you want to be. One of the things you do with people who are struggling is you make the simple even simpler, because then they can get a toehold. Like if they're really barely able to move. I had one client, he had a hard life, man. He was like 85. He'd fallen off a ladder and broken his neck, and they had permanently fused it. So he was basically like this. He could hardly move. He was so depressed. He literally couldn't get out of bed. It was awful. And he was in chronic pain because of his broken neck. And so the first thing I did with him was get him to sit up for like 30 seconds. That was it. That's where he had to start, And after I worked with him when he was in the hospital, after 2 weeks, he was walking down the hall and able to sit up and read for, 5 or 6 minutes. And he got out of the hospital. He went home, but he had to start with the simplest possible steps. And hey, man, this is the definition of humility in some ways, is that you start progressing where you can start. Well, one of the really difficult things to learn when you're down and out is how far you're down, because it's humiliating. I was ill recently, and when I started to recover, I couldn't really button my shirts. I had to learn to do that again. I had forgotten how to put my hands on keyboard. I didn't know where to put my hands. I had to learn to type again. Now, I hadn't lost all the knowledge, and it came back quite quickly. And the reason I'm saying that is because one of the impediments to people who've really taken a blow in their life is that things have fallen apart around them so badly that where they have to start is humiliating even to consider. The rule, it's a pretty straightforward rule when you want to get back on your feet. And the rule is you have to make the task small enough so that you'll do it, no matter how small that is. I mean, one of the things I've become well known for is my advice to start by cleaning up your room. But I had plenty of clients who they couldn't go home and clean up their room. They hadn't cleaned up their room for like 20 years. For all sorts of reasons, maybe because every time they did try to do anything positive in their family, no matter what it was, they were immediately punished and undermined. And so if they even went home and dared to start cleaning up the room, they'd face resistance within the family that was just a manifestation of the 50,000 times they'd been discouraged in the past, but also a move that would upset the insanity that characterized the pattern of familial interactions. And so actually, if they even made a move to clean up their room, what they were doing simultaneously was confronting the dragon in the family that had made every single person in that household insane for like 5 generations, right? So it looks simple. It's not bloody simple. And so in a situation like that, you cut it down so that maybe the first thing they do is clean up, like maybe they look inside one drawer and see the mess that's there and just look at it for a minute
and think about how they might reorganize it if they were going to. When people are very down and out and they decide to make a move forward, in some ways they're facing the whole panoply of problems that confront them in the guise of that single problem, right? It's all lurking behind it, right? It's like, they see the tip of a reptile's tail outside a gigantic closet, let's say, and they look and they think, well, that's just the tip of a tail. What harm can it do me? But it's connected to the whole damn beast. And the advantage to that is that if you make that first step forward, you're actually advancing in the face of all that opposition. The disadvantage is that the first task seems so small that you literally have to be on your knees to be humble enough to lower yourself to take that first step. God, is that all I can do? I'm so useless. You might even be more useless than that because you might fail at it. I had lots of clients who would come back, we'd make a deal that they would do something simple. I remember one client, this is such a comical story in a terrible, dark way. He was an overgrown infant and he was 30. He was still living at home in his messy, high school room under the thumb of his mother, conveniently for him, because then he never had to do anything. And he had managed to entice some girl into sleeping with him and she got pregnant. And now he's going to have a son. And he had enough sense to come to me and say, I'm kind of a wastrel and I've mucked up my life, but maybe I'd like not to destroy this kid. So is there something I could do to put myself together? So, we talked that through. We negotiated, which is what you do with a client if you're sensible. You lay out the problem first. Okay, what the hell's wrong with you, do you think? You have to listen and listen and listen while the person unfolds everything that might be wrong. They put all their cards on the table and then you sort through them and you think, well, some of that's not really the central issue. And so you imagine they lay all the cards on the table and then you kind of get rid of 90% of them.
It's a symptom.
Yeah. It doesn't really bother me now that I've talked about it. That doesn't seem key. I think I'm really done with that. That isn't interesting to me, but they'll still have to lay it all out. And then you focus on the problem. And then the next thing you think is ask them is something, this is great general problem solving strategy is, okay, if this could be better as far as you're concerned, what would better look like? And then they have to lay their cards on the table about that. So you do the same thing. And now you have the diagnosis. That's the problem statement. And now you have a hypothetical cure, let's say, and now you need a strategy, right? And that would be the steps in between the problem and the final destination. And then you break down the steps until you find a step that the person will take. And you have to do that experimentally. So the first step for him was to vacuum the carpet in his room. And so this is literally what he did. He brought the vacuum. It was a stand-up vacuum. He brought that into his room, but he only got it to the threshold. And then he left it 45 degrees across the door, leaning, and he walked over it for a whole week. And so then he had to come back and tell me, and he was embarrassed. He said, I got the vacuum cleaner just to the doorway and I left it there. And then instead of bringing it into my bedroom, I just, I put an obstacle in my own path and stepped over it for a whole week. It's a very humiliating thing because he knew that his life was on the line and he knew that his son's life was on the line. And he knew that he was one useless bastard for not being able to bring that vacuum cleaner into the room, but the proper interpretation of that in part is, well, you got the bloody thing out of the closet, didn't you? So what we did was renegotiate. This is called collaborative empiricism. It's a behavioral approach for clinicians. And the collaboration is, well, as I said, what's the problem? Diagnosis. What's the potential solution? The person has to be on board with all this, right? I mean, they have to be the people who decide that's the problem. You can't enforce that on them. They have to discover it for themselves. And the same with the solution and the same with the strategies. It's like, I don't know what's right for you. I'll listen. We can jointly explore what might be the right vision for you. And then we can break that down into a strategy, but you have to be on board with the strategy. You have to feel that this is right for you. And then we'll say, okay, well, maybe this is a solution. Why don't you go implement it? Come back next week after having attempted this. Let's see how it went. And sometimes people come back and say, well, that went great and it started me and I did 3 other things and we seem to be on the right track. And sometimes they come back and say, nope, that didn't work at all, like with the vacuum cleaner. And so then you have to think what you do in that situation is make the task smaller. If you make the task small enough, I've never seen anyone not be able to progress if they made the task small enough. But, that can be pretty humiliating Now, the upside is that once you take that first step, you've looked the beast in the face and you'll start progressing, not linearly, but exponentially in speed. So what's cool is that it doesn't really matter how small that first step is because it'll start doubling, and anything that doubles grows unbelievably quickly. And so that's a very useful thing to know too. And that's true when you're learning anything new. It's like you'll feel like an imposter. You'll feel like a fool because you are. And you'll think, I'll never get there. And it might be, the destination might look very distant. But if you take a sufficiently small first step and get the ball rolling, you can be cruising along at a pretty good rate, generally faster than you'll think. What seems to happen when you expose people to small but challenging tasks, it does two things. It makes them more skilled because now they're actually dealing with the problem. And so they're acquiring the new perceptions and the new behaviors that are mastery. So they're actually expanding their domain of conceptual structures and actions. That's both conception and skill. But at the same time, they're seeing themselves as the actors that can change the direction of their life.